Fiat CR.42 Falco was the fighter that exposed Italy's biggest opening mistake in World War II, keeping a frontline biplane in a 1940 air war. It entered service in 1939 and was still being sent into combat over France, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and even the Battle of Britain in 1940. The CR.42 could still turn tightly and punish careless opponents, but that was no longer enough. Some people still remember it as one of the finest biplanes of the war, while others treat it like a relic that should never have been near a front line in 1940. Both reactions miss the main point. Italy was not using a bad biplane. It was using a very good biplane to answer the wrong decade's question. Fiat CR.32 was the fighter that taught Italy the wrong lesson before the real disaster even began. It first flew in April 1933. The Reggiane Aeronautica acquired more than 1,000 examples, and its reputation was forged, above all, in the Spanish Civil War, where maneuverability and aggressive flying still paid off. People still defend it by saying that for the mid-1930s, it really was a strong fighter, and that defense is fair. The trap was that good for its time turned into good enough for the next war in Italian thinking. By the time Europe was moving into a faster and harder air war, Italy was still carrying confidence borrowed from the CR.32 era. It was not a joke for the mid-1930s. It was a success that convinced Italy a formula that had already peaked still had another war left in it. Fiat G50 Freccia looked like the machine that would finally drag Italy into the modern fighter age, but it never became the clean break it seemed to promise. It made its first flight on February 26, 1937, entered service in 1938, and 683 production aircraft were built, plus 5 prototypes. On paper, that should have been a strong transition point. Monoplane layout, metal structure, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpit. The cockpit usually gets most of the attention, especially the awkward compromise between a modern canopy idea and what pilots actually wanted to live with in combat. But that only scratches the surface. The deeper weakness was that the G50 looked more modern than it really was. Its armament was too light, its performance margin was too thin, and the design did not have the headroom a real wartime main fighter needed. Macchi C-200 Saetta was the kind of fighter that keeps a country alive in the air without ever making that country dangerous enough. The prototype first flew in December 1937. By June 1940, when Italy entered the war, about 156 were already in service, and total production reached 1,151 aircraft. It fought over Malta, North Africa, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union, which tells you this was not a side issue or an obscure type. Many people still call the C-200 underrated, while others never get past the weak punch of its guns. Both camps are touching the truth without quite finishing it. The Saetta was rugged, agile, and useful, but useful was not the same as decisive. It was the fighter of a country that had finally reached adequacy and stopped there. Reggiane RE-2000 Falco 1 was one of those aircraft that always sounded more important in possibility than in outcome. It first flew on 24 May 1939, entered service in 1940, and 186 were built. Flight testing suggested real promise, and even now there is a recurring feeling that Italy should have backed it harder because it pointed toward a more modern future. That idea only sharpens the real verdict. The RE-2000 never became central to the war Italy actually had to fight. Instead, it remained limited, scattered, and oddly peripheral for something that seemed to offer a better road forward. It was another almost answer that looks stronger in hindsight than it ever did in national service. Fiat CR.25 was the fighter that revealed how easily Italy could drift into side routes while the main problem remained unsolved. It first flew on July 22, 1937, and only 12 were built. As a twin-engined long-range fighter and reconnaissance aircraft, it had a respectable paper logic: escort work, long-range cover, strategic reconnaissance. What says the most about the CR.25 is that it is remembered less as a notorious failure than as a strange wartime footnote. That obscurity is almost the verdict by itself. The CR.25 never became big enough, numerous enough, or urgent enough to matter to Italy's central fighter crisis. In a war that demanded a main answer, It lived and died as an elegant detour. IMAM Ro.57 was the kind of aircraft that made sense only if Italy still had time to experiment. It was based on a 1939 design, did not enter service until 1943, and only about 50 production aircraft were completed, plus a prototype. The twin-engined, single-seat layout suggested a heavier alternative to the standard fighter line, but the war did not need another uncertain branch. Some people still look at it as a forgotten heavy fighter, while others see it mainly as a design that lost itself once it drifted toward the attack role. My own read is simpler. Once a fighter needs that much explanation to justify what it was supposed to be, it has usually already missed its moment. The Ro.57 arrived too slowly, in too few numbers, and with too much role confusion to become anything but another dead branch. Reggiane RE.2001 Falco II may be the most underrated dead end in the Italian wartime lineup. It first flew in June 1940. The first production aircraft were cleared for operational use in June 1941, and 237 were built. That matters because it means the RE.2001 was not a paper machine. It was a real operational tool, flexible enough for escort, strike, and even night fighter work. It often gets treated as the sensible Reggiane that was crowded out by the more famous Macchi line, and that judgment is close to the truth. The problem is that being the smart second choice is still a way to disappear in wartime. The RE.2001 was useful, capable, and still not important enough to become the fighter that defined Italy's air war. Macchi C202 Folgore was the fighter that ended every lazy excuse about Italy being unable to build a serious wartime fighter. It first flew on August 10, 1940, entered Regia Aeronautica service in July 1941, and roughly 1,100 were built. In combat over Malta, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, the C202 finally looked like a fighter that belonged in the same argument as first-rate opponents. To this day, some people praise it as one of the most underrated Axis fighters, while others cannot stop pointing at its weak armament. Those reactions are really two angles on the same problem. The airframe was good enough to win respect, but the system around it was still too thin. The Folgore did not fail as an airplane. It failed because Italy could build the right fighter without building the depth needed to let that fighter carry the war. Dewoitine D.520 belonged to Italy only because Italy's own fighter line had not delivered enough in time. The type was capable of about 530 kilometers per hour, and the Regia Aeronautica used it in 1943 because the shortage of modern fighters had become impossible to hide, and the defense of bases in Sicily and southern Italy could not wait. After the armistice of September 8, 1943, some D.520s were recovered, but they saw no significant further employment. The aircraft is usually remembered through the French story of the right fighter that came too late. In Italian hands, the meaning is even blunter. It became proof that Italy had reached the point where even a foreign stopgap was more useful than waiting for a domestic answer to mature. Macchi C205 Veltro was one of the cruelest near successes of the war because it was not really missing much except time. The first C205 flew in April 1942, entered squadron service in 1943, and by the September 1943 armistice, the Regia Aeronautica had received 177 Veltros, with 146 delivered to operational units. In pure aircraft terms, the Veltro was close to what Italy had needed for years: faster, better armed, and much more competitive against strong Allied opposition. It is easy to romanticize the C205 as the fighter that might have restored Italian prestige, or just crown it the best Italian fighter and leave it there. That is too flattering to the timeline. The airplane was good, the clock was simply better. By the time the C205 appeared, the war was already narrowing the value of late correctness to almost nothing. Fiat G55 Centauro looked like the fighter Italy should have been building around if history had been even slightly kinder. By the armistice on the 8th of September 1943, only 35 G55s of all series had been delivered, including the prototypes. Later, 148 were delivered to ANR units. The best Italian fighter argument almost always ends here or at the RE.2005, and that argument reveals more than it first seems to. The G-55 mattered because it looked less like an exotic standout and more like a true main fighter answer. That only makes the outcome harsher. Its quality and its quantity never matched, and by the time it appeared, Italy no longer had the fuel, stability, industrial freedom, or time needed to scale any promising design properly. It was not a false hope. It was a real hope delivered into a national situation already too broken to support it. Reggiane RE-2005 Sagittario was the aircraft that made Italy's fighter story feel almost cruel by the end. The prototype first flew on 9th May 1942. The type entered squadron service in April 1943, and only 48 were delivered before the armistice. Those 48 did see real combat in the defense of Naples, Rome, and Sicily, which is exactly what keeps the aircraft glowing in memory. The RE-2005 attracts the kind of admiration that late-war cult fighters always attract. Beautiful lines, strong paper performance, and the aura of something special. That admiration is fair as admiration and almost useless as strategy. The RE-2005 may have been among the best fighters Italy ever put into the air, but it remained a legend too small to save anything. Messerschmitt Bf 109G marked the point where northern Italy had stopped waiting for an Italian answer at all. After the 1943 split, the ANR began re-equipping with Bf 109G6s in June 1944, and in total, the force operated about 300 G-series aircraft, mainly G6, G10, and G14 variants, plus 2 G12 trainers. Attention often drifts toward the camouflage, the unit markings, and the identity of ANR formations, but those details sit on top of the real story rather than replacing it. Northern Italy was no longer relying on an Italian fighter line to recover. It was borrowing survival from Germany. The Gustav did not reveal a tactical failure of the aircraft. It revealed a strategic failure of Italian continuity. Messerschmitt Bf 109K pushed that same message even farther. Italian service received only 3 K4s, and the first example reached second Gruppo in December 1944, when the system underneath it was already collapsing too fast for any aircraft to repair. In Italian markings, the K4 almost feels like a collector's epilogue to the war, and militarily, that is not far off. It was not a recovery. It was a late appendix. The Kurfürst could still fight, but it represented the last stage of dependence rather than any return to an Italian solution. Bell P-39 Airacobra carried the southern half of Italy into a different kind of dependence. In June 1944, the Italian co-belligerent Air Force received 170 P-39s. 149 were actually used, and Italian P-39s flew more than 3,000 combat hours, mainly in low-level missions and especially ground attack over Yugoslavia. Those numbers matter because they show the Airacobra was not a token aircraft. It was a real working tool inside the Allied supply system. Even now, some people still find the Airacobra awkward, while others insist it was badly underestimated at low and medium altitude. In Italian service, that argument matters less than it does elsewhere. The real point is that southern Italy was now fighting on borrowed logistics, borrowed supply, and borrowed continuity. Supermarine Spitfire V showed that the old Italian fighter line was already over, even if the war itself was not. The first Spitfire Vs reached 20th Gruppo of 51st Stormo on 15 September 1944 at Lecce. By 31 December 1944, there were 17 on charge, and 40 Mark Vs were eventually acquired. 2 of them even flew the Regia Aeronautica's last wartime mission on May 5, 1945. The Spitfire itself almost automatically attracts praise, which is understandable. In this story, though, that praise can blur the point instead of sharpening it. Once Italian pilots needed Spitfire Vs to remain frontline relevant, the national fighter line was no longer recovering. It had already been replaced by Allied capability. Italy's problem was that by the time it finally got close to the right answer, it was already too late, too fractured, and too short of everything to turn that answer into real power. Japan's problem was completely different. Its deadliest carrier fighters were slowly trapped and worn down by range, doctrine, and attrition. Click into the next episode.